Martin Luther said, the Bible is alive. It speaks to me. It has feet. It runs after me. It has hands. It lays hold of me. I'm hoping today that we can all say that this text will lay hold of us. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to do a 50,000-foot flyover, chapter 13 and 14, and then we're going to parachute into chapter 14, take a closer look, and then we'll zoom back out, okay? If that's confusing enough for you already. In chapter 13, we find the Antioch Five. John Piper says in chapter 13 that what is taking place is the church is setting apart Rick, Randy, and the rest for the work. Actually, they're sending out two missionaries. Their names are not Rick and Randy, it's Barnabas and Paul. Now, we know Barney. Barney was voted most huggable in high school. Paul was formerly known as Saul. And Paul and Barnabas are taking the gospel all over the map. So I brought a map for you today, just to show my love for you. All right, here's the map. We're going to keep it up for a little bit. Someone said, when traveling, lay out all your clothes, all your money, then take half your clothes and twice the money. Traveling always costs more than we think it does, doesn't it? It always takes longer than we first imagine. I've had experiences like that, thanks to my good friends at American Airlines. You would have to be in pretty good shape to take this trip with Paul. I mean, you better be doing some Zumba or some CrossFit or something, because this guy's moving. What we have in chapters 13 and 14 is a travel blog. The journey in chapters 13 and 14 covers 895 miles. That would be like going from Nashville to Miami on foot, or New York City to Nashville on a donkey. So you'll see on the map that they begin in Antioch and walk to the port city of Seleucia. We find that in chapter 13, verse 1. Then they board a ship to the island of Cyprus. They preach throughout the whole island. They stop at little huts and have some fruity drinks with little umbrellas in it because it's 5 o'clock somewhere. The governor gets saved on the island of Cyprus. Then they set sail for Perga. After Perga, they go to PA, not Pennsylvania, but Pisidian Antioch. And there are actually like 16 Antiochs in the ancient world. The ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, named a bunch of cities after himself. And so the moral of the story is if you ever conquer a new planet and you colonize it, be more creative than him. All right? Get lots of names, spread them out. Here's what I want to give you today. Paul's map and our map. What does it look like when God sends you on a journey? And I want to point out 3 quick traveling truths that was true of Paul's journey, and it will be true of yours as well. Here's the first. God sends people on costly journeys. Costly journeys. Have you heard of Murphy's Law? It's little axioms of certainty, bite-sized expressions of truth. One of them says, nothing is as easy as it looks. Another one says, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. I think old Murphy was a pessimist. We don't find Murphy's Law in this text, but we do find the missions law. And here's the missions law. We will not reach the nations apart from personal sacrifice. And we will see this today embodied in the life of Paul. Paul dealt with more than a dead car battery and flight delays. Tony Morita said, Paul embarked out with the Holy Spirit, a Bible, a passport, and a first aid kit. And he would desperately need them all. Paul would traverse barren landscapes, swollen mountain streams, coastal swamps. Probably the toughest part of his campaign would be to get through the Tarsus Mountains. The Tarsus Mountains were inhabited by brutal, lawless tribesmen who would confiscate everything from the travelers and then slaughter them. We also know in this journey, according to Galatians chapter 4, that Paul was deathly sick. So let me apply this to you. What hardships are you facing, and how are you enduring them? In adversity, we get to advertise the greatness of the gospel. My point is that you never go through an adversity alone. Lottie Moon said, you are immortal until your work is done. I like that. Now here's truth number 2. God will send you to places to export the gospel. Now this is the first time that the church went out without being forced out by persecution. God allowed persecution for a time to serve his purpose, to move his gospel throughout the nations. But that's not what's taking place here. They are gladly going. The Old Testament was a stay and shine faith. God designed Israel to be attractive to the nations, so the nations came to Israel. But in the New Testament, it's completely different. It's a go and glow faith. The last command of Jesus is the first command of the church. William Carey said it like this: to know the will of God, we need an open Bible and an open map. When you accept the call to become a follower of Christ, you accept a call to become a missionary. And it may take you to foreign lands, or it may take you to your coworkers, but you will go and glow, because that's what the gospel does. The first missionary journey we find in chapter 13, verse 1, began in a worship service. They were fasting and praying. It begins in the heart. If there's no zeal for the king, there will be no zeal for his mission. First, they were gathered for worship, then they were scattered for mission. Here's the third truth. God will send you outside of your preferred travel area. Paul went to city centers. Now, here's my plea to you today. Don't be city negative. A lot of people don't like cities. God may call you to a city. Tim Keller, New York City's Yoda, said that he and Kathy moved to the city out of duty, not out of love for the city. He grew up in small town PA. Not Pisidian Antioch, but Pennsylvania. You say, Kyle, why should I care about cities? It's crowded. The traffic is horrible. Not to mention the crime rates. Well, I think there are two main reasons you should care for the city. The first reason is there is more imago Dei, that's Latin for the image of God. There's more imago Dei per inch in cities than anywhere else in the world. Here's the second reason. Cities have more reach for good than small towns. They have more capacity for righteousness. And you may be thinking, yeah, Kyle, but they also have more capacity for wickedness. And you're right. To a farmer, a horse is a more valuable animal than a mouse. Yet a crazed horse is capable of far more damage than a crazed mouse. So too is the city's strength under sin. It can unleash a destructive evil. But you take a city that's under the sway of the gospel, and it is a powerful force to be reckoned with. I once worshiped my way through a book written by Tim Keller entitled Center Church. And in it, he said that in ancient cities, it's estimated that they were about 5 to 10 acres in size, containing an average of 240 residents per acre. Now, just by comparison, the island of Manhattan in present-day New York City houses 105 residents per acre. And that's with high-rises. Cities were massive in this day. The people and just look at our world. The people in our world are moving into the great cities of the world faster than the church is. And that's a problem, because we're not going where the people are. Paul goes to large, influential cities. He knows he can reach the villages from the cities. You can't reach the city from the suburbs, but you can reach the suburbs from the city. And I want you to take notice of one main priority of Paul all on this journey. Every stop, every church that he planted, he had one priority. The priority was ordaining elders in every local church. You find this in chapter 14, verse 23. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church. And how did they appoint elders in every church? With prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. You say, Kyle, what's an elder? What's that about? Let me give you 3 quick facts about elders. Number 1, there are many names referring to the same office. There's pastor, bishop, and elder. Now, pastor, the Anglo church, the white church, has often attached itself to that, and they call their leaders pastors. Elder, the Mormon church, has attached itself to that and twisted it into heresy completely, and they often take the term elder. Bishop, the African American church, they typically call their pastors bishop. Just recently, I had a guy visit, it was last Sunday. last Sunday, and we were talking after. Samantha brought him up to me, and she said, "Hey, this is Bishop Kyle." And then he asked me later. He's like, "Hey, man, I never heard of a pastor called Bishop before. What does that mean?" So let me ask you, what does it mean? Which one is right, pastor, elder, or bishop? All of them. All of them are right because they're all names for the same office. Now, typically, probably more people here lean towards elder because it's the most used term for pastor in the Bible, but they're all good. We have people here that call the pastors pastor or elders or bishops. One guy asked, "Hey, what's that new hip term that you guys use to refer to pastors? What is that new hip term?" "Oh, yeah, elders. Elders." Elders is not hipster. Elders is older than Dick Van Dyke. It's 2,000 years old. We're not trying to be innovative. We're striving to be biblical. So here's the first point about elders. There are many names referring to the same office. Here's the second point. There are no senior pastors in the Bible. There aren't. And there's a lot of healthy debate on this topic. And I don't want to bring it here. It's a 4-day weekend. I'm going to bring it here. All right. Some say, we have elders too. We have a pastor and his staff. It's like we have varsity and we have the JV. And if you get a visit from the senior pastor, then you really got visited. First of all, there's not one person that's called the pastor in the New Testament, especially not senior pastor, except for Jesus in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4. So we reserve that title for Jesus. Jesus is the senior pastor at Faith Family Church. Now, I don't want to overstate my argument. Just because there's not one explicit reference to a one-pastor church in the Bible doesn't mean they didn't exist. And it's not heretical if they exist today. But we choose a plurality of pastors. Because 15 years after the resurrection, the elder structure was in place. So we don't have junior varsity pastors around here or junior varsity bishops around here. They're all on the same level. They all have equal say. And this doesn't mean that they all do the equal amount of preaching. Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy showing that some elders have the primary preaching and teaching task. But in our church, every elder doesn't weigh in on every decision. Typically, I would lead in a lot of those. But if it's big decisions, all the elders would agree. And you say, "Kyle, why do some churches not do this? Why are some churches not elder-led?" I think there are many reasons. I think some of them is tradition. Typically, your red brick First Baptist Church is led by a committee or led by boards. Maybe a finance committee or maybe a deacon board, but it's just tradition. That's the way they've always done it. Another reason is ignorance. People just didn't know that the Bible gave particulars on how to have structure, leadership structure in the church. Some people have two different types of elders that I don't believe is found in the Bible either. They have ruling elders and then they have teaching elders. So the teaching elders would meet the qualifications found in the Bible of a pastor, an elder, or bishop, but then the ruling elders, a whole set, would be like some businessmen who do well with money or something like that, and then they would come alongside. They don't have the call to be a pastor, an elder, or a bishop, but they would function as a leading elder. So we don't do that either. We have one elder. They're all the same elders, right? They all feel a call to be in the ministry. Thirdly, I think there's a fear of change. We've done it for this way for so long. How could we trust a group of men to make the decisions for the whole body? Just a fear of change. Here's, I think, the biggest one that we see today. We don't adopt this model because we like corporate models better. We would rather adopt the Walmart structure instead of the biblical one. And so pastors are now CEOs. Pastors don't need to be CEOs. Pastors need to be shepherds to lead the people. All right, here's the third fact about elders. I'm going on a little tangent about elders here today. Here's the third facet about elders. There's always a plurality of elders in the New Testament. Plurality is not only biblical, it's also incredibly practical and wise. Let me just share some benefits of that. It protects you from the mistakes you could make as a lone pastor. Different pastors are gifted in different areas. Some are prophets, some are priests, some are kings. Some are prophets, they're gifted in preaching and teaching. Some are priests, they're gifted in counseling and prayer guides. Some are kings, they're gifted in administration. Prophets, priests, and king. Only Jesus did all three of them perfectly. In our church, we have 2 elders, and then we have an elder apprentice who's working to be an elder. Dan is our elder apprentice, and he's responsible for a lot of the training. I am the elder responsible for preaching and vision, mainly. Kent is the elder that's responsible for pastoring pastors. I call him the soul doctor, because if our soul suffers, so does yours. So there are many different benefits of a plurality of elders in a church. It helps us to divide the elder task. It makes up for the deficiencies that other pastors will have. For instance, I've never been strong with evangelism. It's one of my weaknesses. Kent loves evangelism. I don't know what it is. He walks inside a house, a whole family just starts crying, they get down and they all get saved. I'm like, how did that happen? He's like, I don't know. I knock on the door, nobody comes. Just kidding. If you're filling out a card, you're like, does he come to our house? We won't knock on your door. Okay, don't sweat that. But people are gifted in different ways. It also keeps pastors it guards them against sacrificing their families. Larry Osborne, no relation to Ozzy Osbourne, but Larry Osborne said, if you lose your family, you've lost. And I think that's true. I think also a plurality of pastors, this is the last one, it guards against the celebrity pastor movement that permeates the Christian subculture. The church is not built around one rock star senior pastor. It's built around a plurality of servant leaders. If I ever leave this church, and we're not planning on it, we are rooted here, we are planted here. But if I ever leave this church, in an ideal situation, we would not have an interim pastor or a search committee. The other elders would just preach more until God raises up an elder from within or brings an elder from without. So this is the journey. This is the map. That's the highlights. Let's go. Tray tables up, seatbelts on. Acts chapter 14, verse 6. We have a crisply told healing account. Now, we're not meant to camp out here, but to hit a few highlights and then see the reaction of this event. So when I was studying this healing account in my preparation, I developed a lot of points about how this whole event is a shadow to a greater reality. When we will all lay aside sicknesses and disease, and we will be with God forever if you're a believer in this Christ and you accept his claims. So I wanted to spend a lot of time there, but I can't. Because the plot is unfolding not to show emphasis to the healing account, but to show emphasis to what happens after the healing account. Luke no doubt wants his readers to recognize a parallel here between this healing account and the healing account by Peter in Acts chapter 3, because they have 3 identical phrases. Both men were lame from birth, both looked directly at the person who was healing them, and both walked around after the healing, doing backflips. But we are meant to be drawn to the wild emotional response of the people once they saw the miracle. So notice chapter 14, verse 11. And when the crowds saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker, and the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. So the crowd's superstitious and even fanatical behavior is hard to comprehend unless we throw it into some local background. So let's shine some light on this. 50 years previously, the Latin poet Ovid had narrated an ancient local legend. And the people from Lystra, or Lystra, depending if you're from the north, you pronounce it Lystra. That's probably correct. I'm a redneck, so I'll pronounce it Lystra, but Lystra. We call these people Listerines. That's not the normal name for them, but that's the name I've given them. They walk around with little bottles of mouthwash, and they never have dragon breath, all right? So the Listerines believed that 2 gods, Zeus and Hermes, had visited them. And they believed that Zeus and Hermes had descended on their town of Lystra some years earlier, disguised as mere humans. And in their incognito, they sought hospitality from 1,000 homes, and they were all denied. At last, however, they were offered lodging in a tiny cottage thatched with straw and reeds from the marsh. Here lived an elderly peasant couple who entertained them out of their poverty. And later, so the myth says, Zeus and Hermes rewarded them, but destroyed by flood the homes which would not take them in. So the Listerines were thinking in this story, they saw this healing account and they figured, hey, they're back again. They're here. Let's not have this happen again. Zeus and Hermes, let's praise them. So they dubbed Barney Zeus. Zeus was the macho god, so apparently Barney was a great, big, handsome, imposing, ripped figure, like your pastor of preaching and vision. They dubbed Paul Hermes. Hermes was a god who invented speech, and we know that Paul liked to talk, so they said that's Hermes. Verse 11, and when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices in Lycaonium. The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Now, Paul didn't speak the language, so he didn't know what in the world they were saying. He just knew that their breath smelled fruity, minty, and he liked it. But they didn't know what in the world they were saying. They started hearing chants in another language, then a mini parade with bulls and big Christmas wreaths hanging around the bulls' necks, smoke ascending from the pot that they were intending to offer sacrifices, and then suddenly it hits Paul and Barney. They think we're Zeus and Hermes. And Barnabas was like, oh, they definitely think I'm Zeus. Paul, they're not thinking you're Zeus. You weigh 105 pounds. Paul's like, thanks for the encouragement, Barney. I just get in this story. I don't know why. Verse 14. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, notice what they did. When they had all this praise heaped on them, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowd, they stoned Paul. I wonder at this moment if Paul remembered the stoning of Stephen, which he had a hand in before coming to Christ. This particular stoning was a mob lynching. I mean, you've got to be really mad at someone to travel 100 miles just to throw rocks at them. They were mad. And they were mad because they're legalists. They didn't like grace. And Paul was saying things like, it doesn't matter what your past looks like. It's the Father who qualifies you. He was saying things like, you can't out-sin God's grace. I'm a former terrorist. That's what he was preaching. And some of you here, you think your past is pretty rough and that it's pretty terrible. Have you read the Bible? There are a whole slew of people in the Bible who would chuckle at what you think is unforgivable. You are the right candidate for grace. Come to the feet of Jesus and lay down your efforts, confess your sin, repent of it, and bank your eternity on the empty tomb and the occupied throne. After this, they drug Paul out of the city, supposing that he was dead. And picture this scene, the disciples gathering around him, covered in stones. They could only see a leg sticking out from among the rocks. You can imagine the sadness and the sorrow and the weeping. And then the text says, and Paul rose up. I like that. He just got up. Some people believe Paul rose from the dead because the word arose in the Greek is used many times in the New Testament for resurrection from the dead. However, in this passage, this word has been used twice already. The first time it was used was when Paul said to the cripple, I want you to rise and walk. That's the second time. So I believe what happened in this verse was a miracle. Not of resurrection, but of immediate restoration and revitalization. Multiple wounds healed. Fractured bones reset. Concussion healed. Now let me stop here and give you a little application. Just like Paul, we should reject the praise of men. Randy Alcorn wrote the book, Lord Falgren's Letters. What you have there is one kingpin demon writing letters to an underling demon, instructing him on how to destroy the church. marriages, and personal lives. I mean, you guys should buy it. I don't even read fiction, but I was drawn into this book. It would just open your eyes to the spiritual battle that goes on around you, the things that go on that we are clueless of. But Lord Falgren gave this advice to a demon, and I quote, "Inspire church members to treat pastors like people did the carpenter. Either worship them or crucify them, or first one and then the other." Is that not so picturesque of what happened here with Paul? Friends, refuse the praise of men. Deflect it when it comes to you. If you're full of the devil, that's one thing, because a demon can be cast out. But if you're full of yourself, that's another thing. People have a tendency to love the vessel instead of the one that flows through it. So don't let it happen with you. Walk humbly. Don't draw attention to yourselves. Art Azurdia said that there's one Christian singer, and if you have him come and sing at your church, you'll have to, number one, fly him first class. Number two, when he arrives at the hotel, you have to have sushi in the room waiting for him. That sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? He had those same requirements. I mean, seriously, don't take yourself too seriously. Just learn to laugh. And we shouldn't just stop at refusing the praise of men. We should take the next step and be willing to refocus it. That's what Paul did in this text. He says, I'm made of the same stuff you are. Turn from this religious trash and turn to God. Now I'm looking at some of you that love me. Some of you love me like a brother. Some of you love me like a crazy uncle, the one you don't want to show up to your family reunions. Right? Some of you love me like your kids. Some of you love me, and that's good. There's supposed to be a healthy love for me and the other pastors around here. That's good. But please don't let your faith rest in me. I've seen pastors who have fallen into sin, like horrible sin. There's a whole group of people who they came to church. The whole time it appeared that their faith was in Jesus, but it was apparently in that man, because as soon as that man fell, they were gone, never to step back into the door of a church again. Why? Their faith rested in a man and didn't rest in Christ. So please hear me clearly. I don't plan to fall. Not something I'm wanting to do. But please hear me. I will fail you, but Jesus never will. Now, I want to have a gospel-centered journey. I don't know what stops my life will have. I don't know what stops yours will have, but we want to have a gospel-centered journey, right? So how do we do that? Let me give you 3 quick ways. All right, I'm kind of like Paul in the Bible. Finally, we're not even close to the end, all right? But let me give you 3 quick ways. Here's one way we can have a Christ-centered journey, a gospel-centered journey. We can do contextualized evangelism. You're like, what in the world is that, Kyle? We can do contextualized evangelism. That's faithful and flexible evangelism. Whom are you evangelizing? Do you have a list of people that you're praying over and working with, trying to bring them to Christ? You see, we want to proclaim Christ to our friends, but we want to proclaim Christ in a way that is suitable for our friends. Think in this chapter here, Paul didn't quote Psalms to these people. He made his point of contact with where they were at. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. Chapter 13 and 14, let's do a little comparison of chapter 13 and 14. Paul is preaching in both of them to 2 different groups of people. Chapter 13, Paul is preaching to educated Jews. Chapter 14, Paul is preaching to illiterate pagans. The only recorded address in the Bible to a whole group of illiterate pagans. Chapter 13, Paul is preaching to a large city, PA. Chapter 14, Paul is preaching to a quiet backwater town, according to Ramsey, Lystra. Chapter 13, the most notable resident there would be a Morgan Freeman. Very classy guy. That's where he lives, PA. Chapter 14, the notable resident there would be Larry the Cable Guy. He's the country type. And Mater, all for cars. You know, Mater, like tomato without the tub, Mater. That would be a notable resident there. That's 2 different crowds. How do you present the gospel to two different crowds? Well, what did Paul do? In chapter 13, he started with the law. He's going through the whole Old Testament history. You can see it there. The entire, just walking through this genetics of the Old Testament, showing that Jesus was from the seed of Abraham. Because, why? Because when they were looking to accept Christ, they had an open Bible. Is this the promised Messiah? But notice, Paul didn't do that. He had flexible evangelism in chapter 14. He didn't approach that the same way. He contextualized his evangelism. What did he do in chapter 14? He started with common ground. They were farmers. He says, hey, look at these tomatoes in the rain. You know who sent the rain? You know who grew the tomatoes? God did. God did that. So he contextualized here. And I love that Lystra, there's a notable convert in the city of Lystra. There was a grandmother that got saved there named Lois. And then she had a daughter named Eunice. And eventually, after they were converted here, they would lead their son and grandson to Christ named Timothy, whom Paul would travel with a little bit later. Here's what I'm trying to say. Be wise in how you present the gospel to people. Often, Sarah will be like, you're speaking over people's head. She'll probably say that today at the end of the sermon. Look, what is contextualized evangelism, Kyle? Could you say that easier? We need to be careful not to speak over people's head, right? But we need to contextualize. We often make statements. As Christians, some of you here are not believers. Some of you are believers. Some of you are brand new believers. Some of you are very, very close. We've been praying and working on you for a while. You're very, very close. Today could be the day. But let me just talk to the Christians for a minute. Sometimes we make statements that are persuasive and compelling to us, but they are based on all sorts of premises that a secular person does not hold. Know your different contexts. For instance, let's just add it in the preaching realm for just a minute. The kind of preaching that sounds passionate in the heartland may sound like a dangerous rant in a subculture of certain cities. Sometimes people will send me people to listen to. They're like, what do you think about this guy? His preaching is passionate. And I'm thinking, this is an unorganized rant. I'm a little scared just watching it on screen. But it's just different ways of measuring passion. You've got to know the crowd. You've got to know your friends and know where they come from, especially in a military community, because not everyone's from the great state of Kentucky. Yeah, that's right. Not everyone is a Kentucky Wildcat fan. I'll say amen right there, all right? You've got to know your crowd. You've got to know who they are. You want to find a point of contact and a point of conflict. A point of contact with the people, and then a point of conflict with what they are believing. Show where that collides with the gospel. To reach people, we must appreciate and adapt to their culture, but we must also challenge and confront it. This is based on the biblical teaching that all cultures have God's grace and natural revelation in them, but also they have rebellious idolatry in them. For instance, this week I was reading in the last century about Hudson Taylor, the founder of the China Inland Mission. He started to wear his hair very long and braided like Chinese men of the time. And he put on their clothes and he ate their food, and many of his fellow missionaries derided him. But Hudson Taylor had thought through what was essential to the gospel, and therefore non-negotiable, and what was a cultural form that was neither here nor there, and might in fact be an unnecessary barrier to effective proclamation of the gospel. And this is not saying that all cultural elements are morally neutral. Far from it. Every culture has good and bad elements in it. Yet it's important for us in every culture to flex as far as possible so that the gospel will not be made to appear unnecessarily alien. Whenever you begin, wherever you begin, whether it's with grass or philosophy, end here. End with the cross and the resurrection of Christ, because everybody needs that. Find a point of contact and then a point of conflict. So what are 3 ways we can make our journey Christ-centered? Number 1, we can do contextual evangelism. Number 2, we can do intense discipleship. Intense discipleship. The discipleship you see taking place in chapters 13 and 14, you can't accomplish this in a 13-week book. It's a lifetime. It's not even a 3-year seminary course. In Acts, here's the pattern of discipleship. Life on life, centered on the word. After the stoning of Stephen, Paul walked right back into the city, which blows my mind. He wasn't like, oh, Lystra's closed to me. No, he went right back in and finished the sermon. What verse was that at? 14? Oh, 15. 15. He was an expositor. Verse 15. Okay, let's pick up at verse 16. Right? That's what he did. So what's he thinking? His face is still hanging in the post office in these cities. But you just got to love Paul. He's a persistent little guy, isn't he? He has spunk. Not many people live to tell what it was like to be stoned. That's usually a one-time experience. You see, evangelism took him to these cities the first time. Discipleship took him there the second time. He knew that these young believers could fall off the horse easily. And he wanted to give them a saddle and teach them how to ride. So, would you answer this question to yourself? Who am I discipling? And who is discipling me? See, here's what I love about the gospel. Here's what I love about our church. People from different cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds gather around the beauty of the gospel. Really good news brings strangers together. Now, we need to be seeing more of this, but I love what we're seeing here in our church. You know, someone who cleans hotel rooms, discipling someone who owns multiple businesses. Officers discipling enlisted discipling officers. Why? The gospel brings people together. And if we're going to disciple, we need a couple of things. We need, one, a gospel-centered endurance. A gospel-centered endurance. I think a true discipler is someone who doesn't quit, who doesn't give up, who sometimes is willing to go to bed late at night. What kind of discipler are you? Be persistent. Paul is our model of a gospel-driven endurance. Everywhere Paul goes, he's getting knocked out. I mean, can this guy not take a punch? He's beaten like the Glass Joe on Tyson's Nintendo game, the Punch-Out. He keeps going. In boxing, people often say, we don't know if he has a chin. In other words, he can knock people out, but we're not sure he can take one to the chin and stay on his feet. Paul had a chin. He was brutally stoned, cut, bruised, his body scarred for life. When you track his journey, it's like tracking a bleeding animal in the snow. Paul has tenacity. Friends, don't be easily discouraged when you're discipling someone, when you're evangelizing someone. In chapter 13, Paul was ran out of the city because they didn't want to hear the gospel. And so what did he do at the end of the city? He shook the dust off of his shoes. In chapter 14, Paul shook the stones off. When you give the gospel and when you disciple people, there's going to be mixed reactions. In this chapter, it produced revival and riot. The gospel divides. If the gospel we are proclaiming does not divide, we no longer have the gospel. You're either in Adam or you're in Jesus. Some people will be open to it, some people will oppose it. Sometimes it's like knife cutting in granite. It's just a grind. And sometimes it's like knife and butter. That's like it is with Ken. It's butter, baby. Everybody's getting saved. God's people aren't afraid of a little opposition. The world may not be your cheerleader. People may not understand why you do some things and why you do not do other things. And although there's immense pressure to conform, we aren't afraid of a little opposition. So sometimes we'll say, you know what? I don't do that. I'm a believer in Christ. I don't look for worth, contentment, happiness in that. Because I've been down that road, and I'm telling you, it's going to leave you empty. I found true satisfaction in Christ. We aren't afraid of a little opposition. In other words, you're going to have to shake some things off. This happened to Jesus' disciples. Each place they went, they compelled people to make a decision for or against Christ. And if they didn't listen, Jesus told them to shake the dust off of your shoes on their front porch. This was a sign symbolizing Some people are choosing to remain outside God's offer of salvation. Now look, he's not shaking them off. He's shaking the offense off. This is not vindictive or insulting. He's provoking people to think. I can just picture a conversation between Jesus and his disciples. And maybe Jesus asked them, when you're rejected at the door, what are you going to do? And they say, shake it off. And he says, when you feel insecure or unsafe, what are you going to do? They say, shake it off. Church, we need to learn to shake it off. When someone rejects you because they reject the gospel, church, what are you going to do? Shake it. When someone you invited doesn't show up, what are you going to do? When you're tempted with the lure of luxury, what are you going to do? When you feel the temptation to fear what other people think about you, you just have to shake it off. You see, sometimes there's an unhealthy introspection. Well, I didn't present the gospel good enough there. I don't have the ability to disciple. I'm not sure that I could do that. Well, they're not listening to me, but they're not listening because it's coming from me. Fritz, do you understand the gospel? The gospel is not dependent upon how well you tell it. The gospel is axiomatic. You don't defend it, you release it. Like the Spurge said, it's like holding back a lion trying to protect him. You don't keep a lion chained. You release the lion to let the lion do what the lion does. Now, what I'm about to say is not good English. My wife used to teach English. I used to teach Greek grammar. So what I'm about to say isn't good English, but it's good theology. Let the gospel do what it do. Long before Taylor Swift told her disciples to shake it off, Jesus told his. And you can shake it off. You know how? Because Jesus shook it off. Sin tried to tempt him, and he just shook it off. His culture tried to marginalize him, and he just shook it off. The grave tried to hide him, he just shook it off. Death tried to hold him, and he just shook it off. Let's be like Jesus. Just shake it off.